Hi, thank you for joining me today. I really appreciate you guys stopping by. Today's video is going to be pretty interesting because we're going to talk about and I'm going to show you how to set up the 1907 shelter half. Now, the 1907 shelter half actually had a pretty short stint in the US military as far as real active use, because a few years later they came out with some improvements with the 1910 shelter half and even the backpack system and everything and how it was carried was just very different. The world changed, and really the world that the 1907 shelter half was designed for was dead and gone. But interestingly, as far as scouting history and even early campcraft writers, when they talk about trying to get people out into the outdoors, this style of shelter half would have been pretty perfect for them, because generally people start out with just very basic materials that they have at home, like a blanket or maybe some cheap plastic tarp or something like that, just to get them going, because tents and other gear can get pretty expensive. They can rack up. But you don't need all that expensive equipment to really spend time in the outdoors. And that's the point of the early campcraft writers. They were trying to embrace a movement, and sure, they talked about all this awesome gear and equipment that you could have for your particular use to get out there and hunt and camp and fish and any other outdoor recreation. But in truth, you really didn't need all of that. So what I'm talking about is the bedroll. Now you can see from my back here that I have the bedroll in a horseshoe pattern. Now I've talked about this several times in my various videos when I talk about backpacking, historically speaking. What's cool about the 1907 shelter half is that it was designed specifically to be used in a bedroll across the shoulder or in a horseshoe or horse collar fashion, but over the shoulder and tied or strapped at the bottom. And I think that feature is pretty neat. It also makes it very versatile for other uses. Like when I have my backpack with a frame, I have a bottom shelf, and the way I fold the shelter half is in a rectangular pattern, and it straps among itself. So then I can use it just for the bottom part. The way that this shelter half can also be used is it folds up on itself, and you can use the supplied straps and the loops that's built into the tent so that when it's folded, you can cinch it down into a nice compact rectangular fashion. And I use that as a first layer on the shelf of my frame backpack. And it works out really well. And immediately I can just pull it out, set it up, no fuss, no muss. Now I do want to give a special shout out to my patrons on Patreon. I really appreciate their support. If it's something that you're interested in helping out this channel and pushing it forward, anything that you give is sincerely appreciated. Check out my Patreon page, Mr. Dyer's Musings. All right, so I'm going to show you how I unstrap this, and we're going to get it set up. Now, as you can see, that I have my flap just right over the bedroll here, and I strapped it down, and I've used the supplied bedroll straps for this tent to wrap it around my my haversack as it is. And then I took some rope and I tied these two in the bottom. Now these straps are just very thin pieces of the same canvas that the tent was made out of, and it has some very basic buckles down here that I use to kind of work it around and cinch it down and hold it. I try to make it as simplistic as possible for deployment. So now I undo that, I can just pull it and it releases, and I can push that off to the side. Now you can see these are bent over. Now originally these were pretty long. Remember, this is supposed to be slung over the shoulder, so it is a little bit longer, but I bent that up so that pinches it so that anything that's kept inside here remains sealed. Nothing's going to fall out. So as you can see here, this is the type of buckle that was used. And it stays in place on the tent because there's another buckle all along the ridge portion of the tent. So there's 4 of these throughout the entire length of the tent, and what's nice is you can also use this to set up over a branch in case you don't have the poles with you. You can adapt this so it's hung on a horizontal branch. I think that's pretty neat too. That copies a lot of other early 20th century tent styles. Inside the tent, what I've done here is I've kept my 2 sets of poles and all my wooden tent pegs that I would need to set it up. Of course, I could always cut my own poles, cut my own tent pegs if out in the field. But this makes setting it up really quick and really easy. So there is a triangular or bell in the back, and the front is left open. This goes in line with the early 20th century idea that having an open air environment is actually healthier. You don't want to keep breathing in stale or bad air. So that's a carryover idea for the 19th century into the 20th century, but there's a little bit of truth with it as well because of the condensation. Now these tents are canvas, they're cotton, they do breathe. They don't breathe as well as our modern nylon tents do though. So that was a big fear, especially in cold weather or even wet, damp weather, that you're going to breathe in that air, and it's an opportunity for mold and various other things to enter. Now they found out later on that it's not as big as a concern as they initially thought. That's why the military is using canvas tents and even bells on both ends throughout the 20th century. Now tents were expected to be aired out throughout the day when it was dry and it was sunny like today. But it's not like we immediately got rid of it, and it's not like we kept having open end tents. So our scientific understanding and knowledge, our medical understanding and knowledge changed a little bit, and that's where we're at today. Okay, so we're going to stretch this out. Now the length of this tent is a bit of an improvement when we compare it to Civil War tents. And I'll take this opportunity while I'm getting out some stuff, that if you found this interesting so far, if you like this video so far, if you like where it's going, please do me a favor and click like. That way other people find it and it helps them out as well. Now, interestingly, the 1907 shelter half lasted into the 1960s from a couple of my sources. I don't think it was actively used a whole lot. You know, there's other preferential gear, but the U.S. Marine Corps had this tent in their depots up until the 1960s. And when you think about that, that's kind of crazy. The U.S. infantry quickly got rid of it. In 1910, they changed the pattern. Instead of having these ties, they got rid of those. For the most part though, the same size and shape is pretty much the same, except for the ties. And they use the backpack system to strap it on. I think that the ties was a good idea, especially with the adaptability it offers. However, having holes on your ridge can cause some problems too. But I haven't had any issues, and I've used it twice in wet weather. Once was in the winter. I did a camp out with my kids in one of our big snowstorms just to see how well it do. My boy and I went out there and we used it, and it did really well. Didn't have any leaking issues whatsoever, and it did snow about an inch that night. And in the spring, I also used it and didn't have any problems with it leaking in the ridgepole. But I'm not saying that it couldn't. All right, so I have my hatchet. And what I do is I put the poles at each end, easy to get to. Same thing with my stakes. I put them roughly where I want them to be so that they're already stretched out. I do one side first, put the poles in, and I usually put the ridge line on, and then I do the other side. So take out my hatchet. It's going to be used as my hammer. Angle them at a roughly 45 degree from the point. Same thing with your sides, roughly at a 45. Now you want to think this shape, this style of tent peg would hold the tents really well, but they really do. And what's nice is because they're belled, they're actually pretty easy to get out when you need to as well, instead of just straight pegs. That's what's so fun about experimental archaeology, doing stuff like this. The misconceptions that you may have can quickly go away. You get more of an understanding about the brilliance of it all, of our ancestors, and sometimes we just don't know as much as we think we do. Maybe grandpa or grandma knew what they were talking about or doing after all. Now this one is going to change because it is the center, so I like to put it roughly in the center where the tent's going to be and just kind of tack it in, because chances are it's going to change. And I feed this up in the bottom. Stretch it out. Now, if you get one of these tents, you'll notice that there's two sets of eyelets or grommets. One is for your rope. You put a knot inside and then it comes out. The other one is for your tent pole. You don't attach the rope to the nub of the tent pole itself. Now, if you've seen my other videos about setting up this style of tent, you'll have seen that I always put down my tarp, my ground cloth first, and then I'll put the tent over it. And since I'm not actually sleeping in this, it's just for demonstration purposes, I didn't do that this time. But that's a good idea to do, because as a 6'1" guy, getting in here and trying to spread out a ground cloth after it's already been set up can be kind of a little bit of a problem. But I also always use, I always coil my rope after I'm done using it. It makes everything so much easier. So when I'm ready for, all I have to do is just pull this out and it's good to go. I don't have to fiddle around with untangling rope. And tie a taut line, which is what's traditionally used for guy lines for tents. So this is the 1907 shelter half system. So there's two shelter halves that button together. It works really well. As a 6'1" guy at 200 some pounds, I can fit in here, and there's still enough space for me to put my gear and to sleep pretty comfortably. Now, when the weather gets inclement, then you definitely want to have a poncho or something to drape over this end. Otherwise, the water is going to get in and get you and your gear wet. But for 1 to 2 people, this works out pretty well. It's certainly an improvement over my Civil War shelter half system. And because in the Civil War, you had both ends that were opened up. And that's not very comfortable. But this works out really, really well. And it's a little bit wider than the Civil War shelter halves as well. A little bit longer. The bell opens up a little bit of space so you can put your gear. It's really nice that you can roll it up and throw it over your shoulder. I also like how it can self-contain with the strap, so I can fold it up in a rectangular and put it in my pack that way as well. So this is a really nice piece of kit. Now, if you're wanting this exact thing right now, What Price Glory is sold out. I don't know if they're going to be reproducing this exact one again or when they will have one come out, but I did put a link in the bottom of my description so that you can check it out and you can see if another World War I shelter half may be in your future. They're not terribly expensive. What Price Glory gear has never steered me wrong. In fact, a lot of my reproduction gear that I get for my impression comes from them. And I field use it, I field test it for my scouts, with my scouts and everything. And I've never had any issues with it. Their customer service is really good. So again, if you want to check out that link, go below. You can also check out my website, www.honorableoutfitters.com, because on there I have some sources about this. I also have a shop, and it has a bunch of different gear on there, historical and contemporary gear if I can't find the historical side by side, so you guys can compare and shop that way. I also have free sources. Now, one of the sources that I've been reading a lot right now, that I've been diving into, he's a lot like Horace Kephart, a lot like Nesmick. His name is Krebs, and his book is on my book list. So check that as well. It's free, and if you want to purchase your own hard copy, there's links in there for you to get those as well. I appreciate you stopping by. If you like it, please click like. You definitely want to hit subscribe, because next week I'm going to show you a brand new artifact that I'm pretty excited about, and it's going to make my in-camp long-term life a lot easier. And you can still get these today, at least the contemporary forms. So hit the subscribe button, hit the notification button, and I'll see you guys next week. Give a kiss and hug with your loved ones. Take care.